The ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine is sending food prices skyrocketing, raising fears of shortages in import-dependent countries.
While war reigns over Ukraine, a sword of Damocles hangs over the global economy, especially in the developing world. Even before the conflict, developing countries were struggling to recover from the pandemic with record inflation, rising interest rates, and looming debt burdens. Their ability to respond has been erased by exponential increases in the cost of financing. Now, their breadbasket is being bombed.
Together, Ukraine and Russia provide almost 20% of the world's barley supply, 14% of wheat, and 4% of maize, making up more than 1/3 of global cereal exports, including Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. The UN's food agency says only part of the expected shortfall in wheat exports could be met by other countries. The US, which is the second biggest seller after Russia, says its stocks are at a 14-year low. Ukraine also produces 18% of the world's cooking oil. With those supplies also being disrupted, buyers are looking for other options.
Europe, and with it Africa, will be very destabilized in terms of food. We therefore also need to prepare ourselves and reevaluate our production strategies.
But it's not just food exports that are being affected. Russia is a world leader in fertilizer production, accounting for 13% of the world's total output, much of which is now suspended. And the UN says humanitarian crises in countries like Afghanistan and Yemen are being overshadowed by the crisis in Ukraine. The UN says only 1/3 of the $4.3 billion it pledged to fund Yemen this year has been raised. More than 17 million people are in need of urgent food aid there. Meanwhile, it's seeking $5 billion in aid for Afghanistan, the biggest amount ever for a single country.
Funding has dried up, leaving aid agencies no alternative but to slash programs that millions of people rely on to survive. Many fear, and we've already heard these comments today, that Yemen will fall off the radar as other crises occupy the headlines.
The UN says food shortages will likely persist through next year, leaving millions more at the risk of starvation. Tayyibe Aydin, TRT World.
Well, let's get more on this now with Monika Tothova, an economist with the Food and Agriculture Organization. She joins us now from Rome. Welcome to the program, Monika. As we heard there, Russia and Ukraine are both key suppliers of wheat to a large part of the world, really. Tell us more about why you're warning of a potential global food crisis. Who's most at risk here?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. There are two factors. The first one we heard about in the short video you broadcasted, and that's the importance of both Ukraine and Russian Federation on the international food commodity markets. The second one is that we are already in a situation of high food prices, and any additional risk can really tip the outcome. So, for example, in February 2022, international food prices reached an all-time high, exceeding the record which was set in February 2011. This was mostly due to market supply and demand conditions, but also high prices of energy, fertilizers, and other agricultural inputs. So, globally, if the conflict results in a prolonged reduction of food exports by Ukraine and the Russian Federation, there could be an additional pressure on international food commodity prices, and who will be the most impacted? Those will be the poor net food importing countries, many of which are already struggling financially and are likely to suffer the most.
Yes.
Also,
can I interrupt you there, Monika? Because
Sure.
I understand that your organization, the FAO, currently has a team on the ground in Ukraine. What are they doing exactly?
All right. Well, agriculture is very important for Ukraine, right? 30% of the people live in rural areas. Agriculture contributes about 9–10% of. At this point of the year, the winter wheat was already planted in October and November. Farmers are getting ready for fertilize this crop. They are also preparing the land for the sowing of spring crops, such as vegetable, maize, sunflower, etc. So FAO always had a team on the ground. Now they are on the team to support the farmers in the country so they can plant the field, harness their crops, save their livestock, and generally keep producing food.
Yes, and something that's been less talked about is the issue of fertilizer, because Ukraine and Russia are also major producers of fertilizer. Prices had already surged under high energy prices. So what sort of threat does that pose as this conflict drags on?
Russia is a very important exporter of fertilizer. In 2020, it was the top exporter of nitrogen fertilizer, second leading exporter of potassium, and the third one of phosphorus. So the link between the fertilizer prices and the conflict is mostly via energy prices. The increasing global energy prices are likely to increase already high fertilizer prices. And it's also not yet clear how the sanctions, international sanctions on the Russian Federation, what will be the impact on the exports of not only food, but also fertilizer. Now, without fertilizer, the countries that could normally fill in the supply gap that would be left by if the supplies from Ukraine and Russia are not available on the markets for a longer time, other countries could fill up this supply gap, but without the fertilizer, or fertilizer in sufficient quantities, it would be really difficult.
So, Monika, what needs to be done in order to avoid this potential food crisis?
So, there are a number of recommendations. One of them is avoid ad hoc policy restriction to achieve short-term gains. Do not introduce export restrictions on commodities, etc. Keep the global food and fertilizer trade open. Find and diversify your food suppliers. Support vulnerable groups, including internally displaced people, strengthen market transparency and dialogue. So the policy prescriptions are there. It depends now on the countries how they are going to implement them.
Okay, Monika Tothova from the Food and Agriculture Organization. We really appreciate your analysis. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you for having me.